I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the show, we're going to be hearing from the American conservatives, Andrew Day, on the America First anti-interventionist conservative take on the Israeli strike on Iran and the divide in MAGA over the U.S. Israel special relationship. Conservative sort of realism and restraint foreign policy advocates have become entrenched within a portion of the Trump/MAGA movement, so it's important to keep an eye on what figures like Andrew and other writers at the American Conservative are saying. They are a force within right-wing politics, or just American conservative politics at this point. So I think it's important to highlight that. There's points of agreement that I have, of course, and even points of disagreement. And I think this is a rather interesting conversation. So I hope you'll find it enlightening. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Andrew Day of the American Conservative. And by the way, as always, if you can, support me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Now on with the show. Welcome back to Parallax Views. I guess I'm very happy to have back on the show. And I think it was important to get him on at this point. We just saw this Israeli strike on Iran. We're going to be speaking to Andrew Day of the American Conservative about that. And I think, I should have been reaching out to Andrew even before this, because there's been a lot of division in MAGA over Iran and, I would just say more generally, the U.S. Israel special relationship. Why is that, Andrew?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. And let me do a little bit of expectations lowering. I'm feeling quite tired. I was up as many people were until like 3 a.m. just watching this Israeli attack play out on Twitter. I'm sure I was awash in a sea of misinformation. So hopefully I don't have any, bad intel about it. But as far as this divide, it is obviously very salient right now. As far as why it, has come to be, it's been for decades, Israel has enjoyed intense bipartisan support among Americans and especially American political elites. There were some people on the margins on both left and right who were challenging that consensus. So people on the left were questioning whether support for Israel, this kind of, totally unbalanced support for Israel, especially in its relationship with Palestinians, whether that was, good for our values, consistent with our values. And people on the right were questioning whether it was really in American national interests to be supporting Israel, unconditionally. So Pat Buchanan, one of the co-founders of the American Conservative, was definitely somebody on the right who has been talking about that for a long time. He got in a lot of trouble because before the Iraq War, which he opposed emphatically, he was blaming Israel and Israel's American supporters for, creating the support for that war. And Trump came along in 2016. He acted as a kind of circuit breaker. He changed the way that the Republican Party base thinks about foreign policy. He created this kind of outlet for pro-restraint conservatives to be heard because he was so vocally opposed to the Iraq War. He really distinguished himself in a crowded 2016 primary campaign by taking the kind of anti-war position. So, this previously marginalized faction of the right has had more of a voice, and right now is having to respond or react to the fact that Trump, details are still coming out. We're recording right now, Friday, a little after noon. But it appears to be the case that Trump gave the green light to this Israeli aggression against Iran, and that we're going to underwrite their security. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that because there's some disagreement. It seems like the consensus position developing among kind of heterodox voices who are not really pro-Trump, but were kind of, possibly Trump curious. People like Glenn Greenwald, for example. Um, and then also some anti-Trump heterodox voices like Michael Tracy. They seem to be thinking that this was all a ruse. This idea that Trump and Bibi, that's Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, that there was some rift between them. They're saying that this was actually a campaign to lull Iran into a false sense of security, so that it would think it was, heading toward a nuclear deal, when actually Israel was going to back or was going to attack Iran with American support.
I think there's another position one can take, and I believe a contributor, occasional contributor to the American Conservative, Eldar Mamdov, has said this, that Trump is trying to save face now. So he's going on True Social saying, it's going to get worse, Iran, unless you negotiate with us. But then, I think it was last week, Trump was saying to Israel, don't do it. Don't do a strike. Maybe this is just him saving face now, but even if that's the case, it makes Trump look really bad to that sort of America First element of the MAGA movement, because essentially what Netanyahu has done, if that's the case, is call the bluff,
Mm-hmm.
because Trump would say, don't do it. And Netanyahu is responding with, what are you going to do about it? So that's sort of what I'm wondering, if that's what has happened. I don't know what your thoughts are though.
Yeah, I think my position on this is kind of nuanced. I had been arguing that there was a real rift between Trump and Netanyahu, but that it was smaller than some people thought, and its consequences would be more limited unless Trump did something that I had, urged him to do, but didn't really expect him to do, which is cut off Israel or signal that it's going to have no involvement in an Iran, strikes on Iran, including when Iran retaliates. Um, so the most recent time that Trump is reported to have told Netanyahu to hold off on strikes was on Monday. That was reported in the Wall Street Journal. But now we've gotten some indication that that specific thing was a ruse. Israeli officials have told Axios, I believe, that didn't actually happen, and that was leaked to the media to do what I said earlier, lull Iran into a false sense of security. We should note that on Sunday, Trump met with the national security principals of the White House at Camp David, and they were talking about foreign policy, in particular the Iran situation. And then on Monday, Trump called Netanyahu to kind of apprise him of the determinations made in that meeting. My suspicion is that it actually was the case that he didn't tell Netanyahu on Monday to hold off on strikes, that they were trying to keep Iran confused. But I think previously there were some real tensions between Trump and Netanyahu. Trump did a lot of things, but on both occasions when Netanyahu visited, Trump made announcements about Iran, including the fact that the U.S. and Iran were going to have direct talks. And Bibi looked visibly kind of embarrassed when Trump was saying that. The White House has done direct negotiations and come to agreements with some of Israel's enemies, including Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen, which Israel didn't like. But at some point, the Trump administration gave up on talks with Iran, thought that Iran wasn't agreeing to, America's demands, which have hardened in recent weeks. And apparently giving up on negotiations meant, in my view, we're still learning what happened, but in my assessment, it seems to have meant giving the green light, at least tacitly, to Israel. And certainly the White House was anticipating these strikes because, we were, removing non-essential ambassadorial staff and, calling on military dependents in the region to leave because things were getting too hot. So it looks like they knew that
In
this was
other words, this
coming.
may not have been a calling the bluff situation at all. Yeah.
Yeah, but I share your, view that it's sort of a weird thing for Trump to do if indeed he did it, because it does make him look pretty bad. And
Well,
I haven't
especially to a
seen
big portion of his base. Yeah.
I haven't seen Eldar make the point that you made, but or that you
I
said,
think it
but
was Eldar. I could be wrong, but
yeah, no, you're probably right. I just haven't seen it, but It makes sense to me. Like Trump is, it's kind of weird because Trump didn't give a statement for a very long time. And then last night we learned that he was going to talk at 11 a.m. today. And it's like, okay, seems like things are a little more urgent than that. And now he's giving statements to the media and basically saying, oh, I knew all along. They didn't just give me a heads up. Like I had total awareness of this whole thing. And, I'm the biggest supporter of Israel. And their strikes were successful. So I can see, maybe what happened is Israeli officials leaked to the media that this rift was, a ruse, as I've been saying, as a way to give him a way to save face. So that looks like some sort of, orchestrated, cunning campaign, cunning instead of weakness. But I think there's probably, the reality is probably nuanced and maybe there's a little bit of both going on.
What does this mean for people like yourself and others at outlets like the American Conservative that have been critical of the U.S. Israel special relationship and really want to change from the conservative end? I mean, I think people have to understand when it comes to conservative criticism of the U.S. Israel relationship, it may be a bit different in some ways than the sort of left wing critique. I think the left has very narrowly focused humanitarian concerns. And I do think there are people on the conservative end that have humanitarian concerns as well. But I think for conservatives, this is about the issue of, well, why do we have to defend a foreign country and its interests, especially if those interests don't necessarily align with the US? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I'll say I think that there's probably some disagreement within the American conservative, like on our staff, about how exactly to think about Trump in light of these recent events. So I can't speak on behalf of everyone. I think Kurt Mills, our executive director, for example, I imagine he's his measured opinion as we're kind of developing views on what's going on will probably be a bit less critical of Trump than I am feeling now. Um, but and another thing I'll say is, just given the humanitarian catastrophe, like the extent of it in Gaza, a lot of people on the right do have these humanitarian concerns that you mentioned. But you're right that the critique from the right has been a little different. Sometimes people say, well, why should we defend a foreign country? Sometimes that expresses as, well, Israel and Iran can just kind of fight it out. It's not our battle. Just let them duke it out themselves. That's the only way to settle the conflict. My view actually differs from that a little bit. I think the main problem here is one of American sovereignty. Like the Israel lobby is extremely influential on the American government. I mean, there's a reason. It doesn't really make sense that we would have this so-called special relationship with Israel. It doesn't make sense from a values point of view. It doesn't make sense from a strategic point of view. Realism predicts that states like the U.S., great powers will try to prevent a hegemon from arising in a region. And Israel clearly has hegemonic ambitions that we're actively facilitating. So realism doesn't really explain this. What explains this is U.S. domestic politics, and as I said, the Israel lobby and the influence of Israel itself on basically our elections and uh, they're really adept and successful at punishing politicians who deviate from the line that they're pushing. APAC just in the last election cycle alone gave like $100 million to their preferred candidates. So that's my issue, and I don't really see this as, oh well, this is just some foreign conflict, like let's not get involved. My perspective is we're deeply involved. Israel couldn't be doing anything like this without significant American support. They've been the biggest beneficiary of American support for decades. The second biggest beneficiary is Egypt, because basically we pay them off so that they don't cause trouble for Israel. um, we the Iraq War. I'm not going to say that we did that for Israel in any straightforward sense, but Iraq was at the time perceived as Israel's most dangerous regional adversary. We took them out. We've been taking out their adversaries in Syria. Um, so that would be more the way that I would put the concern.
Little bit of to play devil's advocate here. Um, I've talked to some people that say, well, America's an empire and it uses Israel sort of as its attack dog in the Middle East. And I could see why some people would come to that conclusion because, Trump is coming out now saying, well, Iran, you better, bend the knee to me or it's going to get worse. What role does empire play in all of this, if any? And where do you maybe disagree with that viewpoint?
Well, first, I don't really use the word empire, but I'm not totally opposed. I can see how American actions are considered neo-imperial, to the extent that that involves this kind of expansionist element to U.S. foreign policy. But where I would disagree with that, and there might be an element of truth to that. America has tensions with Iran that trace back to the revolution in Iran in the late 70s. Um, and generally, when a country crosses us and then they don't bend the knee afterwards, America just kind of holds a grudge. See Cuba for another example that's more distant from the Israel situation. Um, but my main response to what you said would be it doesn't make sense to see it that way. Like sometimes Israel is called America's aircraft carrier in the Middle East. And people say, well, they're our client, not the other way around. And we're using them, in the way that you described. And I would say, well, what the hell kind of return on investment is this? Like, we don't actually get anything out of this relationship as far as I see. We give them billions of dollars every year. Their actions in the Middle East create like refugee crises, with refugees pouring into Europe, and then those refugees tend to be like really mad at their new host countries because of its role in supporting Israel and doing this. It creates a lot of animosity towards the U.S. Among Muslims in that part of the world. 9/11 was blowback basically for our policies in the Middle East. I don't think that any kind of rational perspective would say, oh yeah, we're getting a lot for our money here. It's the opposite. This is bad for the US. And I think ultimately it's bad for Israel because they're so emboldened. Their basic strategy is just to take out every single state in the neighborhood that, isn't super friendly toward Israel. And they're kind of hoping they'll be safe afterwards. They've been very effective, at taking out Iran's proxy network and now, having a very damaging attack on Iran. But as a long term strategy, I think it's inevitable that it will generate blowback for Israel.
So I'm going to have listeners on one end that agree with you. I'm going to have others that may disagree, that may come down on the, oh, this is just Israel is the lapdog of the empire, and I'll have everyone else in between. But I think what's really important here is you and others, I think, are part of a movement within conservatism to say, hey, the U.S. Israel special relationship has to change. And it's not limited just to the American conservative. We see this with John Hoffman at the Cato Institute and all the work he's done. There is a significant portion of conservative thought in America that is opposed to the nature of the U.S. Israel relationship. And I think in the 2000s, that wasn't the case. I think the voices were more marginalized on the right that questioned the special relationship. These voices are not going to go away, and I don't think they're going to go away within MAGA. How significant is that? That, the sort of Israel critical voices within the right are kind of here to stay at this point, regardless of whether one agrees with these voices or not. Whether someone agrees with you or not is kind of irrelevant because you guys have become a force within MAGA.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I hope that that's the case. This whole situation with Israel and Iran makes me think it might not be, but um, I think that what you just described is going to become intensified over the course of the next few years. It's one reason that I think America's unconditional support for Israel is actually in the long run bad for Israel. And I made this point on X recently that, no one, I mean, some people did. I'm not going to say no one, but if you go back and read reports from during the time of the Iraq War, you'll find some voices who are criticizing Israel and saying this is a war for Israel, but that was a very rare marginal opinion. And I think if the U.S. gets sucked into a war against Iran, which is highly likely at this point, because we're basically going to, defend Israel, and we also have our own assets and U.S. troops in the Middle East who are now targets because Iran clearly thinks that America was coordinating with Israel for this attack. So if we get sucked into a war with Iran, it's going to be like a mainstream view that this is Israel's war. We're fighting a war for Israel. And in many cases, it won't have some of the nuance that I've added in this conversation. And in many cases, it will take on a more kind of sinister tone, and it'll be more of an anti Semitic kind of perspective. So that's not good for Israel or for Jews in general.
Well, yeah, even
Um,
even Jews in America, yeah.
mhm. Right. Two, by and large, I mean, within Israel, most Israelis do support on left and right this uh, you know, these strikes on Iran, but American Jews tend to, see things very differently than like the right wing of Israel, the Israeli government. And polls show that they often disagree with the positions of the Israel lobby here in America. Um, so I think that it could go either way because there is this kind of personality cult element around Trump, if you haven't noticed. So it might just be the case that people online, people like me, are very critical of Israel and saying, this is not good for the United States. This war is basically on Israel's behalf. We could have gotten a deal. We didn't exhaust all the diplomatic options, and this is a war of aggression. We should have no part of it. But among the base, I think it remains to be seen. But one point I will make is it's definitely true that Americans are turning against Israel in public opinion. And half of Republicans under the age of 50 have expressed an unfavorable view of Israel. That's according to a Pew Research poll from, I believe, April. And that's a huge change from what it used to be. There used to be fierce bipartisan support among not just the political elite, but ordinary people in favor of Israel. Now it's like cratered among the left. And it's pretty, it's dropped a lot among independents, but even among the right, it's clear that the future of the Republican Party is going to be much more critical of Israel.
I know what you mean when you say there's a bit of a personality cult card when it comes to the uh, Trump and the base. But at the same time, I don't want to underplay the fact that figures like Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro seem very defensive right now. I mean, they are going after Tucker Carlson and publications like the American Conservative, Quincy
Oh,
Institute,
yeah.
etc.,
Mm-hmm.
constantly with just really like brutal slurs claiming not just isolationism. People like Levin and Shapiro are openly calling people like yourself, like sort of Benedict Arnold traitor types and oh,
Not
Qatari
just
money
people,
takers.
not just people like myself, me. That's what they're calling me on X. Mark Levin and Josh Hammer and those guys. Yeah.
But I think that shows
Mhm.
a bit of they're afraid. I think they're afraid. I think they're on the defensive.
Perhaps. And as far as the personality cult thing, it's kind of normal in a democracy. Like Obama also had a bit of a personality cult among him. Like he was basically a celebrity president, and people found him very charismatic. And it's a similar thing with Trump, just among different class of Americans. But yeah, one thing I'll say is what I think that people on the right, who favor foreign policy restraint, who are very critical of this so-called special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, we should kind of take notes from Shapiro and Mark Levin, because when Trump does something that they don't like, when he acts in a restrained way, in a way that favors foreign policy restraint or seems to, they attack him and they don't put up with it. They compare him to Obama, right? And I think that when Trump does something hawkish, a lot of people who favor foreign policy restraint on the right, they kind of see Trump as like their best bet for their ideas to actually be put into practice. And so there's a kind of reluctance to criticize him too fulsomely. And I think we should just do what the Ben Shapiro's and the Mark Levins of the world do because it seems to work. They have a lot of power. And I'll say it is true that I wrote this article this week called "Trump Can and Must Avoid War with Iran." Josh Hammer of Newsweek, retweeted it and said that I'm like paid by Qatar or something. And then Mark Levin retweeted Josh Hammer and said I'm pathetic or something. But it's true. If you look at the quote tweets, if you look at the replies, if you look at the like ratio of like likes to comments, etc., it was pretty brutal for them. Like the most people popular opinion was against them, but that's popular opinion on X, like Ben Shapiro has the most popular podcast in the world, I think, after Joe Rogan. Mark Levin has a show on Fox News. Like these guys are significantly more influential than I am, even if my, 1,000 follower account on X can actually ratio them for some reason.
That may be true, but they do seem very annoyed with the Tucker
Yeah.
Carlsons. And
Well, they're also
yeah.
worried about Vance. They're very worried about JD Vance and Tulsi Gabbard. They do feel like they've kind of let, this restraint strain of American conservatism has gotten into the White House, and that is a point of serious concern for them.
How do you see this playing out within the sort of right-wing sphere, not just with Iran, but also with, like, what is the future of realism and restraint on the right? Are you hopeful? Are you skeptical? Where do you land?
Um, I mean, you've caught me on a very pessimistic day, because I've been arguing against war against Iran for like 10 years or more than that, like 15 years. I'm 35. I think the first article I ever published was about Iran. And now this thing that I've been dreading has come to pass. This thing that I think was totally preventable has come to pass. Um,
Can you
the
explain that?
red.
Why do you think it was preventable for people that haven't followed this as closely as you have?
Well, so Israel and America have kind of different interests when it comes to Iran. Israel sees Iran as an adversary, and it is true that Iran's leadership says some pretty outrageous things about Israel from time to time, fairly regularly. Although some of those quotes are exaggerated, but they see them as a threat and they want to take them out. From the U.S. perspective, we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. They have a civilian nuclear energy program. They say that they don't want to achieve a nuclear weapons capability. The consensus seems to be that, excuse me, up until 2003, for a few years they did have some sort of weapons program, but that since then, the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, has said that they're not pursuing nuclear weapons. American intelligence says they're not. And so, what we've tried to do, and what Obama did during his administration, was, try to put caps on their enrichment of uranium, so that it's just an amount that's suitable for civilian nuclear energy purposes, but not weapons grade. The Obama deal is sometimes called the Iran nuclear deal. It's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was successful. We had, enhanced monitoring within Iran. Trump came in. He didn't like everything about that deal. He basically tore it up, even though Iran was in compliance. And now he's trying to get a new deal and a better deal. He kind of needed to get a better deal to kind of justify why he tore up the original one. Iran clearly sent signals that they were willing to, accept some sort of JCPOA arrangement again with enhanced monitoring and caps on their uranium enrichment. The Trump administration seems like seemed at first like it was going to come to a deal and it had reasonable demands, but over time they hardened their demand to include no enrichment at all. And that's a non-starter for Iran. Iran is a signatory of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so they have a right to be, uranium enrichment for peaceful purposes. So they rejected that proposal or any suggestion that they would have to give up enriching uranium on their soil. It was very predictable, that they would reject that. And so once Trump pushed for that, and once he said, well, the alternative to a deal is war, that's a pretty bad combo. Like, um, so that's basically why we got to the point we're at now. And Israel's been pushing for war because they degraded Iran's proxies, so they know that they're not going to be attacked by like Hezbollah in response to this attack on Iran. So diplomacy was possible. It's worked before. Iran has a relatively moderate president right now named Pezeshkian. He replaced the previous president who was named Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash. So that opened up this diplomatic opportunity. The Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, authorized his team to actually meet with the Americans and talk about the program. But the American position just became, unacceptable to the Iranians. And that's basically why we're at war right now, or why Israel is.
I know you have to get going, but in closing, I mean, I know you pushed back on it a little, but I do think the sort of realism and restraint element of MAGA is too entrenched for it to completely disappear from the American right wing at this point. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think it's worth considering. Is there anything you want to add to that, or is there anything you think you would want to add that I haven't covered yet?
Well, I'll just add to the first thing you said. I mean, I don't disagree, and I hope it's true that realism and restraint is on the ascent in the Republican Party. One reason for that is because the Iraq War was such a disaster. And, people of our generation, had their political consciousness formed during the Iraq War as it became this total disaster. And as people started to realize that the invasion was based on lies. And, most of the criticism and protest of that war most prominently was left wing, but there was also like the American conservative, which was totally opposed to the war in Iraq. Some members of the American conservative, including Buchanan, even encouraged people to vote for the Democrats just because he thought they couldn't be worse than Bush, and Bush needed to be punished. This faction of the Republican Party needed to be punished.
I
So that's
remember I
one
used to
reason.
have a subscription to the American Conservative during
Oh
those
yeah,
years.
interesting. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people who are maybe not necessarily conservative in their ideological orientation have embraced tech. Like Glenn Greenwald, the first publication he ever wrote for was the American Conservative, for example. Branko Marcetic of Jacobin writes for us sometimes. Um, Another thing that I'll add is it's not the case that in American history conservatism and right wingism were bellicose warmongering ideologies. That's actually somewhat of an accident of history because during the Cold War, um, you know, people like Buchanan actually were Cold Warriors. I've been told everyone at the time was a Cold Warrior, but they were more kind of boldly opposed to the Soviet Union. The Democrats were usually in charge during that period, and they suspected a lot of liberals and democratic socialists of being too soft on the Soviet Union and perhaps even sympathetic to communism. And so
But then
the
after that war ends, they're like, why are we continuing this? Why do we have to
exactly
be the expansionist state? Yeah.
right, exactly. Once the Soviet Union fell, Pat Buchanan was like, okay, let's not antagonize Russia. Let's like incorporate them in a security architecture. We don't need NATO anymore. And obviously that position didn't win out. But the reason it didn't win out on the right is because during the Cold War, there were these Trotskyites or ex-Trotskyites rather, who were very hostile to the Soviet Union because of their anti-Stalinism. And so they gravitated to the right, to the Republican Party, because they saw it as a more, useful vehicle for advancing their anti-communism. And this is basically how neoconservatism was born, through these ex-Trotskyites who were hawks when it came to the Soviet Union. And then, their ascent happened over the course of the Reagan administration. And then by the time George W. Bush came around, they were like in the halls of power. They were like his main advisors. And that's, explains the Iraq war, basically. It was kind of the second generation of neocons. The first generation were a bit more like nuanced, like Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, which was a much more serious intellectual figure than his son, Bill Kristol, who's just like this hack, and now anti-Trumper, who's been wrong about everything throughout his entire career. So, maybe so if we are seeing realism and restraint rising on the right, I would say that that's a return to normalcy for American conservatism, which has tended to have this element that some people would call isolationist, just this view like we're surrounded by oceans and weak countries and friendly countries, just two of them. So like we don't need to be involved in the old world as they see it, this kind of thing, which is not a perspective I totally share, but you kind of get my point. Like it could be the case that as we put the Iraq war in the rearview mirror, this species of conservatism again becomes the dominant one.
Well, hey, thank you again, Andrew Day, for coming on Parallax Views. If you can, let my listeners know how they can read your work and keep up with AmCon.
Sure. So I write a weekly column at the American Conservative, in addition to editing a lot of the web articles. So you can find me there. I've been writing a lot about Iran and Israel lately. And then on X, my handle is at AKDay89.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.